The bite of the late-night air was a familiar discomfort, a thin jacket doing little to ward off the city's October chill. Lena clutched the strap of her tote bag, the weight of textbooks a familiar anchor against her hip. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows that danced at the edge of her vision. It was a walk she'd made 100 times from the library back to her tiny apartment, a route dictated by the bus schedule and her dwindling bank account. Tonight, however, the silence felt different. It was heavier, pressing in on her. She told herself it was paranoia, the product of too much caffeine and not enough sleep. But the feeling persisted, a prickle at the base of her neck like the static before a storm. A car idled at the corner, its engine a low growl that seemed to swallow all other sound. It was a black sedan, the kind of expensive, anonymous vehicle that didn't belong in this part of town, its windows tinted to an impenetrable darkness. She quickened her pace, her worn sneakers slapping against the cracked pavement. That was the moment everything changed. The car door opened not with a click, but with a silent, predatory swing. Two men emerged, moving with a fluid economy that spoke of brutal practice. They were shadows in sharp suits, faces impassive. Lena didn't even have time to scream. A hand, gloved and firm, clamped over her mouth, while an arm like a steel band wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet as if she weighed nothing. She kicked. She struggled, her mind a white-hot flare of panic, but it was useless. She was bundled into the back of the sedan, the door closing with a solid, final thud that sealed her fate. The ride was a blur of darkness and the sterile scent of leather. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the smooth, unnerving silence of her captors. They didn't speak to her. They didn't speak to each other. When the car finally glided to a halt, it was in the sterile quiet of an underground garage. She was pulled out, her feet finding purchase on polished concrete, and marched toward a private elevator. The doors opened not into a lobby, but directly into a sprawling penthouse apartment. The space was a testament to minimalist wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a glittering cityscape. Floors were dark, polished marble, and the furniture was sparse, architectural, and impossibly expensive. In the center of the room, a man stood with his back to them, looking out at the city he so clearly owned. He was tall, his frame outlined by a suit so perfectly tailored it seemed a part of him. It was charcoal gray, the fabric catching the low light. He didn't turn as they entered. "Is it done?" His voice was low, a quiet rumble that vibrated through the silent room. It held no accent she could place, just the clipped, precise cadence of absolute authority. "We have her, sir," one of the men said, his hand still firm on Lena's arm. The man turned slowly, and Lena forgot how to breathe. He was not what she had expected. There was no brutish cruelty in his face, no obvious menace. He was beautiful, in a way that was sharp and dangerous, like a shard of obsidian. His black hair was styled immaculately, his features carved with an artist's precision. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark, intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth. They swept over her, a quick, dismissive appraisal. And then they stopped. A flicker of something, annoyance, confusion, crossed his features. He took a step closer, his gaze clinical. He looked at her face, her frightened eyes, the curve of her body beneath her simple jacket and jeans, the worn tote bag still clutched in her hand. He looked at her hands, then back to her face. His own hands were immaculate, one resting lightly on the knot of his silk tie. There was a faint, almost invisible scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the only mar on an otherwise perfect canvas. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it cracked through the room like a whip. The question was not for her. It was for the men who brought her. The two captors shifted. The target, Mr. Kwan, the woman who has been passing information to the Kims. Long black hair, student type. She was where the informant said she would be. Mr. Kwan's eyes never left Lena's. "The woman we were looking for has a tattoo of a swallow on her left wrist," he stated, his voice flat, cold, and heavy with disappointment. "Show me your wrist." It was a command, not a request. Numbly, Lena held out her arm. Her wrist was bare, the smooth, dark skin unmarked. A silence descended upon the room, thick and suffocating. Kwon Jinwoo looked from her wrist to the faces of his men, and the temperature in the room dropped by 20 degrees. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The fury that radiated from him was a physical force, a palpable wave of controlled violence. "You brought me a civilian," he said, each word a perfectly polished stone of ice. "You brought a stranger into my home." The men visibly paled. "Sir." The description, it was a mistake. A mistake, Kwon repeated softly, the word holding no forgiveness. He turned his back on them, a gesture of dismissal more damning than any tirade. "Leave."
Send minion to Emmy. Now.
The men bowed their heads and practically fled the room. Lena was left alone, standing in the center of a predator's den, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her chest. He hadn't looked at her again. He walked over to a bar carved from a single piece of black marble and poured a measure of amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass. She watched the controlled grace of his movements, the way his fingers curled around the glass. He was a man accustomed to power, to having the world bend to his will. And his men had just made a very, very big mistake. A mistake that had her name and face. He finally turned to face her, leaning back against the bar. He took a slow sip of his drink, his dark eyes studying her over the rim of the glass. The silence stretched, a taut wire of tension. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lena," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "Lena," he repeated, testing the sound of it. It sounded foreign and strange on his lips. "You are a student," it wasn't a question. He must have seen the textbooks that had spilled from her bag onto his pristine floor. She just nodded, unable to form words. "You have seen my face. You have been inside my home. My men, in their incompetence, have made you my problem." He set the glass down with a soft, definitive click. "And I do not leave problems unsolved." He walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. The scent of his cologne reached her then, a subtle, expensive mix of cedar and something like cold smoke. It was intoxicating and terrifying. "You can't just kill me," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. It was a stupid thing to say, a plea born of sheer terror. A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "Killing you would be the simplest solution," he admitted, his voice a low confidence. "But simple solutions are often messy. They leave loose ends. And I am a man who detests loose ends." He walked past her to the grand entryway where the elevator had delivered them. With a touch of a button on a discreet panel, a heavy, seamless section of the wall slid shut, covering the elevator doors completely. The sound of the lock engaging was a deep, resonant boom that echoed in the cavernous space. It was the sound of a vault being sealed. It was the sound of her world ending. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable, his eyes holding hers. "For now," Kwon Jinwoo said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "you will be my guest. You are not to leave this floor. You are not to speak to anyone but me. You will do exactly as I say. Do you understand?" Lena could only nod, her throat tight with a fear so profound it felt like drowning. She was a ghost in this man's world, a mistake he had yet to erase. And as she stood there, a prisoner in a gilded cage high above a city that no longer felt like hers, she knew one thing with chilling certainty. She was not leaving. The first 24 hours were a lesson in psychological warfare. A stern-faced man named Minjun, older and built like a compact refrigerator, showed her to a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment. It was as luxurious and impersonal as the rest of the penthouse, with a wall of glass overlooking the city, a bed dressed in crisp white linens, and a bathroom of gray slate and chrome. There were no personal effects, no photographs, no clutter. It was a beautiful, sterile prison. Minjun informed her that meals would be brought to her. He showed her the closet, already stocked with simple, high-quality clothes in neutral colors, silk pajamas, cashmere sweaters, tailored trousers. They looked to be roughly her size, a fact she found deeply unsettling. It suggested a terrifying efficiency, an organization prepared for any contingency, even the wrong hostage. Kwon Jin-woo was in absence, a ghost in his own home. Lena heard nothing, saw no one but the silent woman who brought her food on a tray and Min-jun, who stood guard outside her door. The silence was the worst part. It gave her too much time to think, to let the fear fester. She was a loose thread in this man's perfectly woven tapestry, and she knew he was deciding exactly how to snip her out of existence. On the second day, he summoned her. Min-jun escorted her back to the main living area. Kwon was seated in a low leather armchair, a tablet in his hand. He didn't look up as she entered. "Lena Roberts," he said, his voice calm. 22 years old. A scholarship student at Northwood University, majoring in art history. Orphaned at 16, you live alone. Your only living relative is an aunt in another state. You have no boyfriend, few close friends. You work part-time at the university library. Your life is quiet. He had dissected her existence in less than a day, laying it bare with cold, clinical precision. Hearing the mundane facts of her life spoken in his voice made them sound pathetic, fragile. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. She refused to let him see her crumble. He finally looked up, his dark eyes pinning her in place. "I want to be certain you are who you say you are. In my world, coincidences are rare. Mistakes are expensive." A quiet student being in the exact location where we were meant to intercept a courier for a rival family, it stretches credibility. "It was a mistake," she insisted. "Your men's mistake." "Perhaps," he conceded, though his expression was laced with doubt. He stood and began to pace, his movements smooth and predatory, like a panther circling its prey. "The Kim family, our rivals, are growing bold. They are moving into our territory, disrupting our operations. They are led by a man who prefers chaos to order. The woman my men were supposed to bring me was one of his messengers. She was carrying proof of his plans to strike one of my businesses." He stopped in front of the window, his silhouette stark against the glittering skyline. "Because of my men's failure, that proof is now gone. And I have you. A witness. A liability. A complication." He turned to face her. "So, you will stay here, where I can watch you, until I have dealt with the Kims. Until I am certain you are not a plant, a cleverly disguised weapon sent to disrupt my home." Before Lena could protest, a sharp buzzing sound filled the room. Kwon glanced at an intercom panel on the wall, his jaw tightening. He pressed a button. "What is it?" Min-jun's voice came through, strained.
"Sir."
"We have a breach. In the garage. It's the Kims. They're here." Kwon's entire demeanor shifted. The cool, calculating businessman vanished, replaced by something far more dangerous. He became utterly still, his eyes sharpening with a lethal focus. "How many?" "At least a dozen. They ambushed the guards at the service entrance." Kwon moved, not with panic, but with a chilling, deliberate speed. He crossed the room to a section of wall that looked like a decorative panel. He pressed his palm against it, and it slid open to reveal a hidden arsenal. He took out a sleek, black handgun, checked the magazine, and slid it into the back of his waistband, all in one fluid motion. He turned to Min-jun, who had appeared at the doorway, a weapon already in his hand. "Lock down this floor. No one gets in or out. Get me eyes on the garage." Suddenly, the sound of gunfire erupted from below, a muffled series of pops that were terrifyingly real. A stray bullet shattered a corner of the vast window, sending a spiderweb of cracks through the glass. Instinct took over. Lena dropped to the floor, her heart seizing. Kwon was already moving toward her. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, and pulled her behind the solid marble bar. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl. The penthouse, once a symbol of untouchable power, had become a battlefield. More sounds of fighting echoed from the elevator shaft. Kwon spoke quietly into a small earpiece, his Korean rapid and sharp. He was giving orders, deploying his soldiers with the precision of a master strategist. Through the chaos, Lena heard a man's voice shouting on the intercom, a taunt from the enemy below. "Kwon Jin-woo, I hear you have a new guest." Be ashamed if something happened to her. You were never very good at protecting the women in your life, were you? The word struck Quan like a physical blow. For a split second, the mask of cold control slipped. Lena saw a flash of raw, agonizing pain in his eyes, a glimpse of an old, deep wound. It was the wound his rivals knew to twist. In that moment, he wasn't just a mafia boss. He was a man haunted by a failure he could never outrun. The immediate danger seemed to intensify, the firefight below growing louder. In the confusion, as Quan was distracted by the taunt and issuing orders, Lena saw it. A service door, partially hidden behind a large abstract painting, had been left slightly ajar by one of Quan's men rushing to his post. It likely led to a back staircase, an escape route. This was her chance. She could run. She could slip out that door and disappear into the chaos. Her mind screamed at her to go, to save herself. But she looked at Quan. He was pressed against the wall, gun in hand, his focus entirely on the tactical situation, but that flicker of pain was still in his eyes. He was protecting his home, his empire, but that taunt had made it personal. They were trying to break him by reminding him of a past he couldn't change. And in a moment of madness, a choice made from something deeper than fear, Lena didn't run. Instead, she crawled silently toward the service door. Her hand closed around the heavy steel handle. With all her strength, she pulled it shut. The heavy bolt slid into place with a definitive, echoing thud. She had just locked herself in. With him. The sound of the bolt cut through the noise of the fight. Quan turned his head, his eyes widening in disbelief as he saw her by the now sealed door. He stared at her, the question clear on his face. Why? She didn't have an answer. She just crawled back behind the bar, her body trembling, and met his gaze. The battle for his home raged on, but in the space between them, a different kind of war had just begun. The adrenaline from the attack receded slowly, leaving a tremor in Lena's hands and a hollow feeling in her stomach. The sounds of fighting had died down, replaced by the tense, clipped orders of Quan's men speaking over their comms. The immediate threat was over, but the danger lingered in the air like gunpowder smoke. Quan stood, holstering his weapon with a practiced ease that was somehow more frightening than seeing him use it. The penthouse was a mess. The shattered window, the overturned chair, the books spilled on the floor. It was a violation of his perfect, controlled world. But he didn't look at any of that. He looked at her. He walked over to the bar and stood over her, his shadow falling across her crouched form. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the weight of what she had just done. She had a chance to flee, and she had chosen to lock the door, sealing her own fate alongside his. Why? He asked, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual command. It was a genuine question. Lena pushed herself up, her knees aching from the hard floor. She met his gaze, refusing to look away. I don't know, she said, and it was the honest truth. Maybe I figure my chances were better in here with you than out there with them. It was a plausible lie, a justification rooted in survival. But they both knew it was more than that. She had seen that flash of pain in his eyes when the rival boss had taunted him. She had seen the ghost that haunted him, and some inexplicable, reckless impulse had made her stay. He studied her face, searching for something, deceit, a hidden angle, a trick. He found none. He saw only a terrified young woman who had made a choice that defied all logic. That was when he said her name. Lena. He said it differently than he had before. The first time it had been a label, the name of a problem. This time it was a discovery. It held a note of grudging respect, of profound confusion. He was seeing her for the first time not as a liability, but as a person, an anomaly in his world of calculated risks and predictable outcomes. He turned away and spoke into his earpiece.
Mignon, report.
The older man's voice came back, calm and professional. The breach is contained. We have 3 of the Kim's men alive for questioning. The rest have been handled. Our losses are minimal. Good, Quan said. Double the security on all levels. I want to know how they got in. I want to know everything. He took a deep breath, the first sign of tension he'd allowed himself to show. And find out who the woman was. The one they were talking about. A heavy silence followed his last command. Minjun's reply was hesitant. Sir, you know who she was. Kwan's back went rigid. Just do it. He ended the communication and stood for a long moment, staring out the cracked window at the city below. Lena watched him, seeing the weight of the past settle on his broad shoulders. The invincible Mafia boss was gone, replaced by a man burdened by a memory. The next few days shifted the dynamic between them. The invisible walls were still there, but they were different now. He no longer treated her as a mere prisoner. He would appear in the living area when she was there, sitting in silence and reading a book or reviewing reports on his tablet. It was a strange, tense cohabitation. He was observing her, trying to understand the puzzle she presented. And she, in turn, was observing him. She learned his habits. He drank black coffee in the morning and whiskey at night. He never relaxed, not truly. Even when he was sitting still, there was a coiled energy about him, a readiness to spring into action at any moment. She saw the cost of his empire, the isolation it demanded. He was surrounded by soldiers, but he was utterly alone. The attack had changed things outside the penthouse, too. The Kim family, having failed in their assault, now knew a civilian woman was with Kwan. They saw her not as a mistake, but as a new lever to use against him. The danger was no longer just about him. It was now pointed directly at her. It came a week later. Lena was in her room, sketching in a notebook she'd found, when Minjun burst in without knocking, his face grim. We have to move.
Now.
Before she could ask why, Kwan was there, grabbing her arm. There's a sniper across the street. They know which room you're in. The words sent a spear of ice through her. They were targeting her. To kill her, to hurt him. He pulled her out of the room and into the main living area, keeping her low, his body a shield between her and the wall of windows. His men were already in motion, pulling down heavy steel shutters that descended with a deafening clang, plunging the penthouse into semi-darkness. They're creating a diversion, Kwan said, his voice a low, urgent murmur against her ear. The real attack will come from inside. As if on cue, they heard a muffled explosion from the direction of the service staircase. The one she had locked. They had breached it. We go to the roof, Kwan commanded, pulling her toward another hidden door. His men fell into formation around them, a moving wall of black suits and drawn weapons. The journey through the back corridors of the penthouse was a blur of adrenaline and fear. Gunshots echoed behind them, getting closer. They reached the roof access stairwell. As they started to climb, one of the Kim assassins appeared on the landing above them, a pistol raised. He fired. Everything happened in a heartbeat. Kwan shoved Lena behind him, spinning to meet the threat. He fired twice, two precise shots that echoed like thunder in the enclosed space. The assassin crumpled, but not before his own shot had gone wild, striking the wall near Lena's head, showering her with plaster and dust. For a terrifying second, Kwan thought she'd been hit. He whirled around, his eyes wide with a raw, visceral fear she had never seen on him before. He grabbed her shoulders, his hands almost bruising, his gaze sweeping over her, searching for injury. Are you hurt? He demanded, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't hide. She shook her head, speechless. He was breathing heavily, the scent of gunpowder clinging to him. In that moment, pressed against him in the narrow, dim stairwell, she understood. The thought of losing her, of her getting hurt because of him, had shaken him to his core. It was a repeat of a nightmare he had already lived through once. The moment was broken by Minjun's urgent voice. Sir, the helicopter is here. They burst onto the rooftop into the deafening roar of rotor blades. A sleek black helicopter was waiting, its doors open. As they ran for it, more of the Kim's men swarmed the roof from another access point. A firefight erupted around them. Kwan shoved her into the helicopter, shouting at the pilot to go. He and Minjun provided covering fire, holding the enemy back just long enough for them to scramble aboard. As the helicopter lifted off, leaving the chaos behind, Lena looked at Kwan. His face was a mask of cold fury, but his eyes, when they met hers, held the lingering shadow of that terrifying, protective fear. He had almost lost her, and the realization had changed him. They were taken to a new safe house, a modern, fortress-like home nestled in the hills outside the city. It was here, in the aftermath of the attack, that Lena crossed a line. One of the captured Kim assassins was brought there for interrogation. He was defiant, spitting curses, and refusing to reveal who had given the order to target Lena specifically. Kwan's men were preparing for a more brutal line of questioning when Lena, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward. "Let me talk to him," she said. Kwan and Minjun stared at her. "This is not for you," Kwan said, his voice hard. "You want information, don't you?" she countered, her gaze unwavering. "Your way takes time. It might break his body, but not his will. Let me try." Something in her eyes, a cold, determined light, made Kwan hesitate. He gave a curt nod. Lena walked into the room where the man was tied to a chair. She didn't look at his bruised face. She looked at the file Minjun had placed on a nearby table. She read it for a full minute, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at the man. "Your name is Park," she began, her voice calm, almost conversational. "You have an ex-wife you still send money to, even though your boss tells you not to. A sign of weakness, he calls it. You think loyalty to your boss will earn you respect. But I know what he says about you. He says you're a dog who's forgotten his master. He told my host that he was glad you were captured, that it saves him the trouble of putting you down himself." The man's defiant sneer faltered. "He's already replaced you," Lena continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, each word a carefully placed drop of poison. "A younger man. One without sentimental attachments. You're a loose end. Your loyalty is a joke to him. Helping us, that's not betrayal. That's revenge." The man stared at her, his bravado crumbling, replaced by a dawning horror. He broke. He told them everything. The order had come from the Kim boss's own brother, a man trying to usurp power by showing his sibling that Kwan had a new weakness. Lena walked out of the room, leaving Kwan's men stunned into silence. She felt cold, hollowed out. She had used another person's soul as a weapon. Kwan was waiting for her in the hallway. He looked at her not with shock, but with a kind of profound recognition. He saw a darkness in her that mirrored his own. Later that night, she found him on a balcony overlooking the dark, silent hills. The tension between them was a living thing, a magnetic pull that had become too strong to ignore. "You should have run," he said, not looking at her. "Back in the penthouse. You should have taken your chance." "I told myself it was about survival," she replied, her voice soft. She moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "I think I was lying." He turned then, his body caging hers against the railing. His dark eyes searched hers, filled with a storm of conflict. "You are a complication I did not anticipate," he breathed, his hand coming up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her skin. The touch was electric, a brand. "I know," she whispered, her heart hammering. He leaned in, his lips hovering just inches from hers. "You have no idea what you're getting into. And you have no idea who you brought into your home," she countered, her voice shaking but firm. That was the confession. Not of love, but of something far more potent and dangerous. An acknowledgement of the unbreakable bond that had been forged between them in chaos and violence. He didn't kiss her. He simply rested his forehead against hers, a gesture of surrender, of claiming, of utter, terrifying honesty. The war for his empire was still raging, but the war within himself was over. She was a part of him now, and he would tear the world apart to keep her. The information from the captured soldier, Park, gave Kwan the weapon he needed. The Kim organization was fractured by internal betrayal, the boss's brother, Lee, making a play for power. Kwan, a master of strategy, didn't plan a frontal assault. He planned to dismantle their empire from the inside out, using their own ambition against them. But Lee was clever. He knew Kwan's primary concern was no longer territory or revenue streams. It was Lena. The next move came not with bullets, but with a simple photograph sent to Kwan's encrypted phone. It was a picture of Lena's aunt, an older woman she hadn't seen in years, sitting on a park bench, completely unaware she was being watched. The message was simple: end this, or the quiet life of your problem gets very loud. They had targeted the last piece of her old world, the final thread connecting her to the person she used to be. The rage that filled Kwan was a cold, silent inferno. It was one thing to attack him, to come for his soldiers, his home. It was another to reach for the innocent. But for Lena, the feeling was different. It wasn't just fear. It was a hardening, a final, crystallizing certainty. Her old life wasn't just gone. It was now a liability, a weapon to be used against them. There was no going back. He thinks this will make you weak, Lena said, looking at the photo on the screen without flinching. He thinks you'll back down to protect her. I will send my men, Kwan said, his voice dangerously low. She will be protected. No, Lena said, meeting his gaze. Her own eyes were hard, resolute. That's what he expects. A defensive move. You need to end this. All of it. Tonight. And I'm going to help you. He saw the steel in her spine, the fire in her eyes. She wasn't asking for protection. She was demanding retribution. She was no longer a victim of his world. She was an active participant in it. The plan was audacious, built on the intel Park had provided. Lee was meeting with a few key captains loyal to him at one of the Kim family's restaurants, planning the final stages of his coup. Kwan's plan was to hit them there, to cut the head off the snake. But the restaurant was deep in enemy territory, heavily guarded. A direct assault would be a bloodbath. They'll be watching for your soldiers, Lena said, looking over the blueprints of the restaurant Kwan had on his screen. They won't be watching for the catering staff. The final confrontation was a blur of calculated chaos. Lena, dressed in the uniform of a server, her hair pinned up under a cap, walked into the lion's den. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she carried a tray of drinks. She had one job: to get inside the private room where Lee was meeting his conspirators and plant a small, discreet listening device, giving Kwan and his team eyes and ears before they made their move. Every face she passed was a potential enemy. The air was thick with tension. She could feel their eyes on her, but their scrutiny was casual, dismissing her as part of the scenery. She was invisible, just as she'd planned. She reached the guarded door to the private room. With a polite, deferential nod, she spoke to the guard. The manager sent a complimentary round of drinks for Mr. Lee's table. The guard grunted, barely looking at her as he opened the door. Her moment of truth.
She walked in.
Lee and his 4 captains were huddled over a table, their voices low and urgent. She moved to the table, her movements calm and practiced. As she set down the glasses, her hand slipped beneath the heavy tablecloth, her fingers finding the underside of the table. She pressed the small magnetic device into place. It was done. As she turned to leave, Lee looked up. His eyes narrowed. I didn't order any drinks. Compliments of the house, sir, Lena said, her voice even, her heart in her throat. He studied her for a moment too long. A flicker of recognition? No, just suspicion. Get out, he snarled. Lena walked out, her back rigid, not daring to run until she was out of the hallway. The moment she was clear, she spoke into the tiny comms unit hidden in her collar. It's done. That was the signal. What followed was not a gunfight.
It was a surgical strike.
Acting on the live intel from the bug, Kwan's men, who had entered through the kitchens, knew the exact positions of every guard. They moved with silent, lethal efficiency. The takedown was swift, brutal, and quiet. Lena waited in the kitchen, amidst the chaos of frightened staff. Then, the door swung open, and Kwan was there. He walked straight to her, his eyes ignoring everyone else. He scanned her from head to toe, ensuring she was unharmed. It's over, he said. Lee is in my custody. His faction is broken. His acknowledgement was in his eyes. He didn't need to say the words. He looked at her not as a civilian he was protecting, but as his partner, his queen. She had walked into the heart of the enemy and had not flinched. She had been the key to his victory. But victory in their world always came at a cost. As they were leaving, Minjun approached, his face grim.
Sir.
While we were here, the Kims made a desperate move. A car bomb. They targeted the safe house. He paused. My brother was on watch. He didn't survive. The news was a gut punch. A loyal soldier, a good man, was gone. The price for their victory had been paid in blood. It was a stark reminder that nothing in this life was free. The weight of that loss settled between them, a shared burden. Later, back in the pristine silence of the penthouse, the city lights spread out below them like a carpet of scattered jewels. The cracked window had been replaced, leaving no trace of the violence that had transpired. Lena stood on the balcony, the cool night air on her skin. Her old life, the life of a quiet student, felt like a story she'd read about someone else. That person was gone, burned away in the fire of the last few weeks. Quan came to stand behind her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid wall at her back, a tangible force. The silence was comfortable now, a language they both understood. Your aunt is safe, he said quietly. My men are with her. She'll be moved to a new home, given a new life. She will never have to worry about anything again. He was tying up the loose ends, protecting the last vestiges of her past. But he knew, and she knew, that there was no going back for her. And me? She asked, her voice soft, not looking at him. He was silent for a long moment. She felt him move closer, the scent of cedar and smoke enveloping her. His hand came to rest on the small of her back, a gesture of possession that was both gentle and absolute. My empire has many soldiers, Quan Jinwu said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. It has territory and assets. But it has only one center. He paused, his fingers tightening ever so slightly, claiming her. You. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a proposal. It was a statement of fact. A truth. Lena closed her eyes, leaning back into his strength. The choice had been made the moment she'd bolted that service door. She had chosen this life, this man, this dangerous, uncertain future. She opened her eyes and looked out at the vast, glittering city. It was his kingdom, and now it was hers too.